My name is Amy, and I'm a passenger on the midnight train. Please excuse the long silence. I sincerely hope you weren't too worried about me. I'm fine. This post will be the second to last update on the midnight train. I'll try to post the final part in a day or two. But let's start from the beginning, or rather where we stopped last time. The laughing man scared me more than anyone else on the train. For everything else, I had my rules. I knew how to deal with the detective, or the man with the briefcase, with the children, or compartment 18, or the frozen corpse. My journey until now has been anything but relaxing, but the horrors around here were predictable. The Laughing Man was new. There were no rules about him, no safe tactic to survive an encounter. He was a variable in an otherwise set system, and I felt more vulnerable than ever. The arrival of the new passenger was not the only thing that had changed at this point. I hadn't talked to the detective since I left the train to search for Lily. In fact, I didn't even see him when walking through the train, and I wasn't sure if that was because I didn't specifically search for him or because he didn't want to see me. The first one was more likely, in my opinion, since I didn't expect entities like him to hold a grudge. By now, I knew better than to apply human logic to inhuman things. Lily didn't leave my side anymore. We went everywhere together. I barely had any time for myself to collect my thoughts and reflect on the events of the day, as I usually like to do. I couldn't blame her, though. She was scared after what happened to her. The Laughing Man's presence only made matters worse. Honestly, I'd rather have her around all the time than living through another orphan's nightmare situation. The Laughing Man showed himself a few times in my proximity, and something about the way he looked at me made me scratch my arms violently, as if I could get rid of the anxiety he induced if I just tore the skin right off. He wore a purple suit, his brown hair was neatly combed, his eyes were changing color by the minute, and a wide grin ripped his face in half. It was entirely impossible for anyone to smile that big, but he did without a break. His lips tore under the tension, his blood was flowing steadily from the small wounds, coated his teeth, and dripped down his chin. I'm not a violent person, yet I wanted to smash his skull just so he would stop smiling. A few things happened in the time after returning from the orphan's nightmare. I almost encountered the dark beast again, but I managed to leave the wagon in time. The children approached Lily and me once, and yes, I was just as scared of them as last time, but nothing bad happened. The man with the briefcase and I came across each other a few times, but we didn't talk except for a polite greeting. It took 2 days until they found the first body. His first victim was discovered in the early morning, a man I had seen around a few times but never talked to. He had always sat on the floor next to a wall, rocking back and forth and hitting his head against the wall in the process. He had quite a nasty scar that had changed its position every time I had seen him. Now, they'd found him dead on the floor in one of the wagons. His whole body was torn apart except for the head. That was untouched except for the eternal smile that had been cut into it. Who could have done it if not the Laughing Man? Merely hours later, the next body was found in one of the toilets. An unfamiliar woman killed in the same way. The same everlasting smile on her frozen face. Lily and I hid away in my compartment for the rest of the day, huddled close to each other on the bed. I reassured her over and over again that everything would be all right, although I doubted it myself. The Laughing Man was out for blood, and if he decided to kill one of us, we didn't stand a chance. The atmosphere of the train had changed since they found the first victim. It had always been oppressing, eerie, wrong in every incomprehensible way, but now a sense of dread had settled in the dry, dusty air, the suffocating silence before a storm. Night fell, and I was almost relieved to hear the hunter's dogs claw against my door. I had no proof for this, but I believed the Laughing Man wouldn't dare to oppose the hunter. Lily managed to sleep a little, but I didn't close my eyes that night. Too distracting were my worries. that the Laughing Man could open the compartment door at any moment, and if I'm honest, I feared the nightmares, the dreams of the hospital I had traversed to find Lily, with its dying patients whose agonizing screams echoed back from the dirty walls. I was scared of the images my mind flashed as soon as I closed my eyes, so I lay awake and stared at the door, ready to jump up and run for my life if it should be necessary. Nobody came by that night. Lily woke up some time after sunrise. "I'll get us some breakfast," I told her, already half out of bed. "Just wait here for me, okay, darling?" "Shouldn't I come with you?" she asked, "to be safe?" "We can't fight him anyways. I'll be right back, and honestly, I feel better when I know that you're here." She nodded, kissed me, and then let me go. It was rather early. The train seemed entirely empty, and it was silent around me again. I was even more paranoid than usual, looking behind me every few seconds. I only had to go to the next wagon, where a few vending machines were placed, and even that seemed way too far from the safety of my compartment. I ran, turning around again and again without ever seeing someone. I pushed the door open. This time it was me who found the victim. I froze in place, eyes glued to the bloody corpse, and I screamed in terror, screamed more and more until my lungs had no oxygen left. I fell to my knees and gasped for air, and then I screamed again. The woman looked even younger than me. She wore a white wedding dress that was torn to shreds. Her limbs pointed in all the wrong directions. Bright blue eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Her face was heartbreakingly beautiful, except for the blood-stained smile that had been cut into her cheeks. The weeping bride would never cry again. The following minutes were a blur. I remember crying, people gathering around me, indistinguishable voices, and horrified whispers. I remember Lily's arms around me in soft, comforting words I barely heard. I remember sobbing and coughing and screaming and cussing as the body was dragged away by the conductor. I remember numbness. "He's going to kill all of us," I told Lily. We lay in bed together. "Pick us off, one by one." "I don't want to die," she whispered. "We have to get rid of him." I wasn't even sure who exactly I meant with "we." My first thought, after seeing a whole lot of movies, was to unite the whole train against him, but that didn't feel like a realistic option. My rules stated that some of the passengers were malicious. Even if they weren't, they were still inhuman, and I was afraid of them. Some were explicitly mentioned in the rules, but with most of them I had no idea about their intentions and abilities. Trying to unite these entities felt like the most dangerous approach possible. I spent several hours in silence thinking. I've never been the hero type and always prioritized my own life over others, so please don't think of me as a selfless person. I forged this plan because the Laughing Man was a direct threat for me, and I would do a lot of things to survive. There was no way I would take any chances. I would survive, and I would leave this train. And if I wanted to ensure that outcome, the Laughing Man had to die. My plan was simple. I wasn't one for convoluted schemes, and I figured a straightforward approach would have the best chance of success. Less variables, less risk, less that could go wrong. I waited until 1 o'clock, and then I waited some more for the sharp claws that were scratching on my door every night. "Mr. Hunter," I proclaimed as soon as the familiar noise started, "would you please talk to me?" The scratching ceased, and the door was slowly pushed open. The sight was familiar, although quite some time had passed since I last saw the blood-covered hunter. His body was covered by leather except for his eyes and his hands, and this time I looked closer. There was no skin left. Veins and muscle lay naked atop his bones. I can only speculate, but I guess the hunter had become the hunted at some point. "What is it?" he asked. "You promised to assist my hunt." I raised my head, straightened my back, and forced myself to look into his bloodshot eyes. "The time has come, and the Laughing Man is my prey." He nodded. I shall fulfill my vow. 3 more hunters appeared behind him, all dressed in the same garb, hands bared of any skin and clothes red with blood. I counted 4 dogs as well, but I quickly looked away from them as their skin was missing too. Make your preparations, the first hunter said. We shall meet here and hunt your prey tomorrow night. Thank you. I raised my fist to my heart and bowed. They repeated the gesture in unison, and without goodbye, the door was shut again. I let myself fall onto the floor as all the tension left my body. I'd lie if I told you I wasn't scared, but I considered the hunters to be one of the most powerful entities on the train. Powerful enough to keep all the passengers in their compartments at night. They were my safest bet, especially since I had trouble trusting the detective anymore. There was still the fact that someone had tried to murder me, and the detective had admitted that he didn't give a shit about me. Now, about my preparation. There wasn't a whole lot I was going to do. It mostly boiled down to one important step. Like I said, I wasn't one for convoluted schemes. The blind beggar woman was easy to find. I hadn't seen her since I made the deal with her to save Lily, but now she was sitting in the first wagon I entered and smiled at me. Nice to meet you again, she greeted me. Do you need a favor? Not a favor, but a deal, I answered. I knew better by now than to owe an unknown favor to an entity like her. I need a sharp knife and a lighter. What would that cost me? She seemed to consider for a moment. An easy request. A bit of your blood shall suffice. How much? I wasn't taking any chances here. She opened her bag that lay next to her and pulled a small ceramic cup out. Not enough to be dangerous for a human, she said, presenting the cup to me. Involuntary blood donation didn't seem appealing, but I realized that the price was rather cheap. Fine, I agreed. She reached inside her bag again and handed me a large knife, as well as the requested lighter. Would you kindly? She smiled and held the cup towards me. I used the knife to cut my arm open and let the blood flow. To be honest, it barely hurt since the blade was really sharp. As soon as the cup was full, she stored it away, pulled some bandages out, and wrapped them around the cut to stop the bleeding. Thank you, she replied. My pleasure. Good luck. I was already halfway gone when I heard her words, but as soon as I turned around to reply, she had already disappeared. I spent the rest of the day in my compartment experimenting with my newly acquired knife. I had stopped in one of the bathrooms on my way back and had taken a can of hairspray with me. That and the lighter would hopefully work as a makeshift flamethrower. The rule stated that fire was feared by humans and beasts alike. I knew nothing about the Laughing Man, so I'd go with my safest bet. Lily basically begged me not to go. She cried and told me that she was afraid I wouldn't come back, that she didn't want me to get hurt. I reassured her time and time again that everything would be all right. I'd come back and we would be safe again, as safe as the midnight train could be, at least. To be honest, I was more likely to die if I just let the Laughing Man continue his deed. Even if he didn't decide to kill me, I'd just hide away in my compartment and would eventually succumb to the train like everyone who hid away did. When the time came and the hunters knocked at my door, I kissed Lily goodbye, grabbed my weapons, and stepped outside. We greeted each other. The hunters carried their guns in their hands, and the dogs growled and bared their teeth. I nodded, fingers wrapped tightly around my knife, and we walked forward without saying a single word. I felt weirdly detached from the situation, as if it wasn't really me walking among dead hunters toward my possible death, calm before the storm. We actually came across the man with the briefcase before we met our target. I didn't wonder why he could be outside the compartments in the night while the hunters roamed. In my mind, the man with the briefcase was some sort of invincible super being, respected by every entity on this train. Good evening, Amy, he greeted me politely as always. Good evening, sir, I replied. Now, my next words were a shot in the dark, but I simply had to try. We want to kill the Laughing Man. Would you care to help us? He didn't even hesitate, just shook his head. Your personal vendetta is none of my business. I should have known better than to argue with the inhuman, but I was too terrified to think clearly at this point. How can you not care? I snapped at him. This thing is killing passengers left and right. One of you will die tonight. The train will be fed either way. Why should I bother? He turned to leave. Good luck, Amy. I guess I'm lucky he didn't kill me for that outburst. The hunters had remained silent the whole time. If they were bothered by the encounter, they hid it well, and they made no comment as we continued our way towards what we were really looking for. Now, the memory of the actual fight is a little blurry. A lot was happening, and the adrenaline was rushing through my body and keeping me from thinking straight. I remembered hearing his manic giggling before even seeing him. I tightened the grip around my knife and looked at the hunters one last time before my eyes fell upon the laughing man. He was taller than I remembered. His head almost hit the ceiling, arms and legs were ridiculously long. His head was tilted slightly as he grinned at us. The easy way would have been to directly attack him with the flamethrower. The thing is, I was worried the train was mad at me for hiding in my compartment for so long. I wanted to appease it first, to ensure my survival after this fight was over. The midnight train craved blood, and I was going to feed it. I wanted to charge forward and stab the laughing man before he had any time to react, but I underestimated the speed of this entity. Before I even knew what was happening, a long arm wrapped around my body and tried to crush me. It seemed to have no bones as it wrapped around me like a snake. I didn't think twice, just plunged my knife into the pallid skin. The man hissed and retreated, yet his laughter didn't stop. I fell to my knees. The dogs charged at him. He whipped his bleeding arms around and threw them against the wall in one swift motion. I picked myself up off the floor and ran towards him, knife lifted for another strike, but his flailing arms struck me right in the head. I was thrown backwards. My eyes watered from the pain in my skull. For a while I was too dizzy to move. Gunshots rang through the air, but the bullets didn't seem to bother him. I wasn't going to go for another strike. I knew I didn't stand a chance. Instead, I threw my knife with all the force I had left, watching it fly and strike his shoulder before landing on the ground. He hissed again, and before I could move, his arm was around my body again. The flamethrower was on my belt. I tried to reach it, but his tight grasp pinned my arm to my side, and I wasn't able to move them. Panic almost overwhelmed me. I struggled against him, but I couldn't move. I kicked without reaching anything. In my mind, I already saw myself dead on the floor. An eternal smile cut into my terrified face. Then, in a single moment of clarity, I leaned my head down and bit as hard as possible into his flesh, hard enough to rip a piece of meat out. It tasted rotten, and I spit it to the floor immediately. He retreated, not completely, but enough. I grabbed my flamethrower, pressed the button, and a bright red flame flared through the hallway directly towards the laughing man. He went up in flames like dried grass. The laughter finally faded as his body was engulfed in flames, but his hand was still on my arm, and the fire spread onto my jacket, burning my skin within seconds. I threw myself onto the ground. My knife was nearby, so I grabbed it and crawled over to the dying body of the laughing man. The train wanted blood. It needed blood, so I stabbed the body over and over again. The fire was extinguished, but the pain in my left arm was still present, bad enough that I forgot to breathe. I don't know how long I lay there, crying and screaming in pain and stabbing a charred corpse. At some point, the hunters said their vow was fulfilled. At another point, I finally fainted. Now, I'll make the cut here and tell the end of the story in the next update. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the next one will be the last. I'll try to post the last part soon. Until then, pick your battles wisely and always be prepared.